MPs will vote today on the amount of money councils in England receive from central government. The total is going down by £1 billion, but ministers insist that councils' spending power will increase as they keep more of the money they raise through taxes. Jessica Parker reports.
Buses, children's centres, libraries, lollipop men and women. Some of the services that local councils have cut across England as their funding has fallen. And again this year, the lump sum that comes from government goes down by around £1 billion.
There's been a really big cut in local government funding over the last 8 or 9 years, at least 20% reduction over that period. The councils which were more dependent on central government, in other words, generally poorer councils, have had bigger cuts. Those that have got big council tax bases, the richer councils, haven't done quite so badly. So overall big cuts, bigger cuts for the poorer councils.
Let's go to Salford and speak to our political reporter there, Phil McCann. Phil, what's the view of this settlement from the North West?
Well, there are calls from councils across the North West, across the country, for more clarity about how councils are going to be funded in future. This year, it's more of the same as what councils have seen for the last 9 years now. More cuts, £22 million at Warrington Borough Council, for example, which is cutting the budget that it pays for Christmas lights. It is scrapping free parking. It's cutting the funding for some social care contracts. And all of these cuts since 2010 have been happening at a time when the cost of some of the most expensive services that councils provide, mostly social care, has been going up because of a huge increase in demand. But something that was pointed out last week by the Centre for Cities and by the IFS is that the way that the system is changing away from the government directly funding councils and towards councils funding themselves, that favours councils in more affluent areas. It means that councils in the north and in more urban areas often lose out because it is more difficult for them to raise more cash from council tax and from business rates.
All right. Thanks, Phil. Let's go to Hayley Mortimer. She's in Gloucester. Hayley.
Well, yes, it's the same picture here, really. Councils have had to make tough decisions over the last few years, cut after cut after cut, and still savings are needed. For example, £21 million worth of savings need to be found by Gloucestershire County Council this year. Now, the plea's always been that helping the most vulnerable must be the priority, but it hasn't gone smoothly here. Children's services are rated inadequate, and there's growing demand on help for the elderly and children with special educational needs. Budgets in those areas have been overspent. The councils had to dip into reserves, and it looks like this year it will be local taxpayers that pick up the bill, with council tax set to rise by 5%. But it's not just the big county councils, it's the smaller districts that are suffering too. In fact, Gloucester City Council was named by the Centre for Cities as being one of the worst hit areas in the country. It's been dubbed the vanishing council because in order to keep services running, it's had to cut the number of staff it has in half, outsource back office services, and this year it's looking at selling its headquarters, the jewel in its crown, and moving into a small rented space in the county council's offices.
Dorking's Children's Centre is staying open, but 31 in Surrey are due to close from April, saving the county council millions of pounds. Services are being concentrated in less well-off areas, but some fear the strain it could put on the facilities that remain.
At the moment we serve 1,500 families in this area. In the future we're potentially going to be looking after 4,500 families on a 50% cut. So that will mean 50% less staff, 50% less resources to meet the needs of all those families in a much bigger geographical area.
Although we'll have this centre here still, much of the universal services will go. I just see that in the future all these children will come into school at reception that may have needed early help that wasn't picked up. I just see that in the future all these children will come into school at reception that may have needed early help that wasn't picked up.
This year's national funding settlement paints a familiar picture. That lump sum from central government to councils has gone down by around £1 billion.
The local government associations say England's town halls face a £3.2 billion shortfall. But ministers say councils have more power to raise money themselves. A 6% cut is expected. Andrew Carter is from the Centre for Cities and explains the areas he thinks are most likely to be affected.
When we look at the data which we put out last week, it is places like Barnsley and Liverpool, Doncaster, Wakefield, Blackburn, those towns and cities that are mainly in the northern part of the country have had the biggest reductions in their expenditure over the period, I suppose, since the recession. So 2009 through till essentially the latest year before we get the settlement today.
What kind of services have been most affected?
Well, interestingly, when you look at it, actually, because of the way that the cuts have fallen, social care is kind of relatively protected. So councils have been able to hold on to the bits of their budget and reallocate. But then when you look at things like street cleaning or arts and culture or planning or libraries and parks, all of those are down by more than 40%. You know, and you know that if you walk around some of these towns, libraries are closing, street cleaning is no longer, every day or every week. Bin collection is now fortnightly in many places, if not more than that. So, you see these kind of erosion of services over time.
And many people will argue it's a false economy, because if we see everything around us looking good, the parks, the streets, the libraries, we feel better about our lives.
We do, and I think we do miss the symbolism of some of these reductions. I was actually talking to someone about the problems we're having on our high streets, and that's a retail problem on the one hand. But when you talk to people, there's a symbolic element to that. They see things not working, closing, boarded up, or streets that aren't clean, and that has a wider kind of civic effect rather than just a narrow the service isn't being delivered.
The government are arguing that councils can retain more money through business rates and need to be less reliant on the pot of government money. So the emphasis is shifting. It has shifted a fair bit already, hasn't it?
It has shifted over that period where councils and localities are more dependent, I suppose, on the money that they can raise locally, which is obviously great for some places. But if you're in Barnsley, if you're in Burnley, the council tax base is not great. Mm-hmm. So if you're raising 3% council tax, it's clearly not as much as doing it in other parts of the country. And actually growing their business base is more challenging in those sorts of places. So they are, by definition, more dependent on central government grant. And it's partly the reason why then we've seen these places that have struggled the most.
We're 10 years on from the financial crisis. The deficit is now coming into budget on day-to-day spending.
But you strip these councils to the bone.
Well, what I was going to say is, surely the answer must be that in the spending review this year, you'll start to see money starting to come back into these areas. But I think also, you probably pay tribute. It's not often done to local authorities, but actually, councils haven't been going bust across the land. Services have broadly continued, and councils have done very well.
But we just heard about
an
services
arena.
being cut
Well,
every
hold
which
on
way.
a minute. Hold on a second. Hold on, Anisha. Hold on a second.
Councils aren't going bust. Hooray! Pop out the champagne corks. I have to say, when we look back in this period of history from 2010 to where we are, we will be ashamed at how austerity has hollowed out our communities and our local government, from libraries to recreation services to adult social care. Councillors are having to literally get everything has been cut to the bone. You can get rid of things, at the sweep of a pen. They're very, very hard to build up again. And I think our councils have borne a heavy, heavy, heavy price, and it's affected everything from care of the elderly to youth services. This is a shameful story of the Conservatives from 2010.
Well, the government can find money when it wants to. It could find money for a private, secret state aid to Nissan, which is all fallen through now. It's put money aside for the contingency of being sued over the seaborne freight contract, as we found out yesterday, something I've been pushing on in the Commons for weeks. And it now has little pots of money to buy off individual MPs to vote for the withdrawal agreement, whereas in real terms it's cut English local government financing by 28%.
Raising extra funds through business rates and council tax is actually more difficult for cities and councils that represent poorer, more deprived areas. Two main reasons for that. The economies in those areas may not be as strong, so raising money through business rates isn't as easy as it is in areas where the economy is stronger. And also raising money through council tax, well, that depends on the value of local housing, because you pay more council tax if you're in a more valuable house, and more deprived areas, as affluent areas, have less higher band council housing. In fact, the Mayor of Liverpool, Joe Anderson, just this week said that a recent rate rise that they instituted in Liverpool raised about £1 million. The same percentage rate rise, if it were instituted in Surrey, would have raised about £7 million.
Let's return now to the local government story, because here on the BBC News Channel we're looking at the situation across England today. Let's go to Gloucestershire now. The council there says it's struggling to keep up with the rising demand of children's services. Let's go to Gloucester and speak to our reporter, Hayley Mortimer. Hayley, morning to you. We know that children's services and social care, of course, in general, sucks up a huge amount of local authorities' budgets right across England. So although the government is talking about more money for councils, what are they saying there about whether they feel they really do have extra funds to spend on other areas as well?
That's right. So it really has been a tough time for councils here in Gloucestershire. Like areas across the country, they're making year after year after year of cuts, and still more savings need to be made. In fact, Gloucestershire County Council has to find £21 million worth of savings in the next year. Buses have already been hit as subsidies were removed, and this was one of the first areas where libraries were handed over to volunteers to run. Now, the plea has always been that helping the most vulnerable must take priority, but it's not gone smoothly. Children's services have been rated inadequate, and there's growing demand for help for the elderly and for children with special educational needs. It means budgets have been overspent and the council has had to dip into reserves. Now, extra money is being put into these areas next year, but it's local taxpayers that will have to foot the bill. That's because that grant from central government is decreasing again, and while extra pots of money here and there are welcomed, it's still not enough. So council tax here in Gloucestershire will have to rise by 5% next year. That's twice the rate of inflation.
And you mentioned, Hayley, that budgets have already been overspent. So even if there is extra money, will that have to go to cover that overspend that's already happened?
Children's services and adult social care are certainly the priority for the council in terms of its funding. But as we say, budgets are tight, the money has to be found by somewhere, and it appears that it's going to be local taxpayers, that council tax, that will have to rise to pay for those vital services.
OK, Hayley.